Used car prices are sky high. On average, a 1-year-old slightly used vehicle is 1.3% more expensive than its equivalent new version. However, you will find more and more voices claiming that the market is in a bubble and that it will crash. In other words, an increasing number of forecasts are pointing towards a significant market decline. However, a reputable source, Cox Automotive, issued an article that takes a firm stance on this matter. They state that used vehicle values are not going to crash. Moreover, they directly criticize an article that forecasts a drop of 20 to 30%. They don't name drop the author of the article they're criticizing, but based on the argumentation, I think it's likely that they're discussing KPMG's article. So an organization of which you can expect credible reports. Hence, we have two completely different forecasts from different sources. Cox Automotive is expecting a 3% drop in 2022, whereas KPMG is expecting a 20 to 30% drop. We already covered both of these forecasts extensively in my used car market update. And you can click over here if you want to see the full market update. However, for the sake of completeness, let's summarize both articles and then discuss why Cox Automotive thinks that a crash is unlikely. As most of you know, prices are driven by supply and demand. Last year was characterized by demand increases and supply decreases. Hence, it was a remarkable year as car prices surged to record heights. Therefore, it's axiomatic that demand or supply needs to change in order for prices to move in 2022. And according to Cox Automotive, prices will drop by 3%, but they won't decrease linearly. Rather, they're expecting prices to follow a parabolic pattern. And this means that prices continue to increase in the beginning of the year. And this is based on a seasonal pattern. Vehicle demand is usually high in the spring following tax refund season. So, when this demand effect erodes after the spring, prices are expected to stabilize. And it's at this moment, so going into the second half of 2022, that the first price decreases are expected and that cars should start to depreciate again. New vehicle supply is expected to increase by this point, and this also has an effect on the used market. Second, car loan interest rates are expected to increase, hereby slightly limiting demand. However, looking at the full year, the net effect of all of this is expected to be small. Cox Automotive is expecting a price drop of 3%. So how can other analysts who are looking at the same market end up with a completely different conclusion? Let's have a look at that. But before we do so, if you like this video, please support the channel by clicking on the like button down below. Thank you. You can, by the way, also follow me on Instagram. It's @4wheeltrader. But now then, let's have a look at KPMG's forecast. They took a different approach and mainly looked at the relationship between the used and new vehicle values. KPMG's report states that a 20 to 30% drop is likely because the relationship between those two values is skewed at the moment and will eventually return to normal levels. They state that used car values increased much more than new car values and that this level is not sustainable. Consequently, used vehicle values will drop until the relationship to new car values is restored. Where that new level will be depends of course on what happens with the new car values. New cars might simply be priced higher, something which means that used car prices won't drop to their pre-pandemic level. Now when it comes to the timing of the price drop, KPMG knows that this depends on the developments of supply and demand. So they made a quadrant to plot all the combinations of high and low demand and supply and plotted their implications. Over here you can see the scenarios in relationship to the new car shortage and therefore in relationship to the predicted used car price drop. You can see that in the most rapid scenario, the new car shortage is resolved by October 2022 and that in the slowest scenario it takes 1 year longer. For all scenarios, they by the way note that used car prices will start to come down before the shortage reaches zero, as the market anticipates this event. So we know now what both forecasts are based on, and this means that it's time to get to the juicy part. Why does Cox Automotive think that a drop of 20 to 30% is unlikely? First of all, they start with the fundamentals as they say that these simply don't support such a scenario. Moreover, they directly criticize the core argument of the other forecast, the one which states that the relationship between new and used car prices is out of place. It's their view that used vehicle prices are not substantially misaligned with new vehicle prices. With an average new vehicle price that sits at 163% of a used vehicle price, the gap between the two is indeed smaller than in previous years. Used retail prices increased with 25%, while new vehicles increased with 14%. This gap, however, fluctuates over time. In 2014 it was, for example, 167% and in 2019 it was 179%. So a gap of 163% between used and new vehicles doesn't seem so strange. But why are there such differences between the forecasts? Surely KPMG would have compared the current relationship between used and new vehicles to the historical one. Unfortunately, we can't answer these questions in this video. We don't have enough information. But I would like to highlight a few things that I noticed. First, I think that KPMG uses a different data source. This graph illustrates that the prices for used and new vehicles are sourced from the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis and the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Cox Automotive, on the other hand, appears to be using their own data. And this of course makes it difficult to compare notes. Second, KPMG states that used car prices will eventually return so that the traditional relationship between used and new vehicle values is restored. And for this to happen, used vehicle values would need to drop by 30% from today's value. They noticed that it could be a bit less if inflation persists, but they mentioned this 20 to 30% drop numerous times. Now if we assume that this would happen, this would mean that the average value of a used car, which at the end of 2021 was $28,205, would drop to $90,744, meaning that they would be around the values that we had before the pandemic. And given that, according to them, this drop is needed to restore the relationship between used and new prices, it would also mean that new cars would need to return to their pre-pandemic level. Something which they think is unlikely, and I agree with them. Hence, I indeed think that the relationship between used and new cars is less skewed than what KPMG calculated, meaning that a 30% drop is a very unlikely scenario. And this ties in nicely with my third and final point. The Cox Automotive article and the KPMG forecast aren't providing a historical time series of the gap they're talking about. In both cases, this could be very convincing, as it shows why they think that the gap is high, low, or at a normal level. Now we just need to guess. Cox Automotive indeed provides a few historical points, but it would be really strong to have the historical series. I also don't have this available, but I did find the following graph. Over here we have the historical year-on-year percentage change for used cars in red and for new vehicles in blue. Now this comparison over here is far from perfect, but it illustrates that historically, used and new car prices can move in different directions, hereby highlighting that the current relationship between the two is perhaps less extraordinary than portrayed in the KPMG forecast. But let's make a little summary after all this talk about the relationship between new and used vehicle prices. So, to sum it up, the article of Cox Automotive states that the relationship between used and new car prices isn't so skewed as displayed in the KPMG article. It's difficult for an outsider to evaluate this as the data sources appear to differ. Yet, according to KPMG, the relationship can be re-established if used car prices drop by 30%, and this means that used values will return to their pre-pandemic level. Hence, for the relationship between used and new cars to be at their traditional level, or in other words the pre-pandemic level, also new cars need to return to pre-pandemic levels, and I think this is unlikely. Adding to this, we also had a look at some historical data which further reinforced the idea that the current relationship between used and new cars might be skewed indeed, but isn't as extraordinary as portrayed. But now then, besides the critique on the relationship between the used and new car prices, the Cox Automotive article also highlights that a drop of 30% by itself is highly unlikely. They state that prices rarely decline more than 10% as demand builds while prices fall. Even during significant events like the 9/11 terrorist attack, the 2008 financial crisis and the 2020 pandemic, prices didn't decrease by more than 13%. Moreover, they add to this that wholesale prices never dropped by more than 5% without an extreme oversupply, while they still see a constrained supply throughout 2023. And to be honest, I think they have a fair point here. Historically speaking, it's very rare to see a drop of 30% year over year. If we go back to the graph that I showed you before, you can see that 13% is indeed the largest year-on-year drop since 1965. However, the fact that we haven't observed a 30% crash doesn't mean that it can't happen. We can only state that the probability that it will happen is low. Think for example about all the articles about the next stock market crash. Most likely they're all wrong, but there will be one day that they will be correct. And with that, let's summarize what we just saw before we discuss what you should do with all this information. We discussed an article written by Cox Automotive in which they state that a 30% drop is unlikely. The The market fundamentals don't support it, and they have some valid points. First, they state that the relationship between new and used cars is not as skewed as what is claimed. And I think there's some merit to this, but it's difficult to evaluate it without having the full dataset available. Second, they state that from a historical perspective, a crash of 30% is very unlikely, and this is true. But what do you do with all of this information as a buyer? Why is it relevant? Well, first of all, it highlights that there's a lot of uncertainty in the market. These forecasts are published by, I would say, reputable sources, and they deviate a lot. Hence, the people who deal with this on a day-to-day basis don't agree on what's likely to happen in the future. Therefore, and I said this a few times before, if you're worried about car values, it might be smart to drive something that you can easily afford. Even in the worst case scenario where prices drop with 30%, the monetary value that you will lose won't affect you so much. Contrary to this, I think it's rather risky at the moment to stretch yourself and buy one of these one-year-old cars which are trading over their new price. Personally, I do then also think that the forecast as depicted by Cox Automotive is the more likely one. Naturally, this doesn't mean that that's the one that will materialize. I just think that the probability of it materializing is higher. The current fundamentals don't support a market crash. Supply is likely to adjust only gradually, as production problems are not solved in one day, and the same goes for demand. I therefore expect a gradual adjustment on both sides, and therefore also in the prices. And with that we arrived at the end of this video. Now if you enjoy videos about car values and would like to see more, then I suggest that you head over to my channel. Over there you'll find detailed market analysis for a large variety of cars. And while you're there, don't forget to subscribe and click on the notification bell so you get notified when a new video goes live. As always, thank you for watching, and I hope to see you next week for a new video.